You have felt it before, the moment your mind goes somewhere the room was not ready for, and the silence lands like a verdict. Maya's hand rose in that classroom the way a question genuinely rises. Not for approval, but because the mind simply could not hold it anymore. The teacher's pause was only 3 seconds, but for a mind like Maya's, 3 seconds of silence is long enough to learn your place. Every classroom has an unwritten rule book, and the first invisible rule is this: curiosity is welcome only when it confirms what is already known. When applause becomes the metric for intelligence, the child who thinks differently learns very fast that thinking differently is a liability. Maya did not stop asking questions that day. She stopped asking them out loud, and that is an entirely different kind of silencing. The cruelest education is not the one that teaches you wrong answers. It is the one that teaches you to fear your own questions. This is where Maya's real story begins. Not in the questions she asked, but in the version of herself she almost agreed to erase. You have felt it too. That quiet tax levied on anyone whose mind refuses to mirror the room around them. Maya's silence at the lunch table was not shyness. It was the exhausting arithmetic of editing every thought before it escaped. Belonging, it turns out, is often a toll booth, and the currency demanded is the most authentic parts of yourself. The cruelty was never loud. It lived in the half-second pause before laughter, in the glance that slid past her like she was invisible. Conformity is not chosen in one dramatic moment. It accumulates, like water rising so slowly the person inside never decides to drown. She began shrinking her vocabulary first, removing the words that made people furrow their brows and pull subtly away. Psychologists call it self-monitoring, the relentless surveillance of one's own behavior to match a social script written by someone else. What the world called fitting in was for Maya a slow and invisible amputation of the self, performed with social smiles as the anesthetic. You have heard it so many times that you stopped arguing. Maybe the problem was never them. Maybe it was always you. Internalizing a false verdict is not weakness. It is what happens when a relentless verdict goes unanswered long enough. The mind, desperate for peace, begins rewriting itself, trading its sharpest edges for the dull comfort of fitting in. She rehearsed ordinary reactions the way actors rehearse lines, performing a version of herself the audience could finally accept. Every suppressed instinct left a small silence where a thought used to live, and silence accumulated becomes erasure. What the world calls too much is almost always just too visible, a brightness that exposes what others prefer to leave in shadow. She was not broken. She was being broken deliberately by a system that mistakes conformity for health. The cruelest mirrors are the ones you build inside yourself, because you can never walk away from the room they live in. You have kept a secret version of yourself alive somewhere, hidden from the people who would not understand, but never fully silenced. Every idea Maya could not speak aloud was pressed instead onto paper, where the world's judgment could not yet reach it. The notebook was not a diary. It was a counter-argument, a rebellion written in ink against every verdict handed down about her mind. Unconventional thinking does not vanish under pressure. It goes underground, surviving in margins and corners until conditions allow it to surface. Each page held an observation so precise it frightened her, proof that the mind she had been apologizing for was functioning exactly as it should. She wrote things she could not say, and in the writing discovered that silence had never been agreement, only a temporary shelter. The notebooks multiplied because suppression is not storage. Pressure without release transforms contained thought into undeniable momentum. What the world called disorder was in truth a different order, a private architecture more sophisticated than the approved blueprints ever allowed. You have felt it before, the strange shame of thinking thoughts too large for the room you were sitting in. Professor Aldrin had watched the same fluorescent classrooms erase the same rare minds for 37 years, and the exhaustion showed. When he passed Maya's desk, he did not keep walking. Something in the margin diagram stopped him the way a rare bird stops a tired hiker. He said nothing about the content at first. He simply asked who taught her to think in spirals, and his tone held no accusation. That question was a key, because nobody had ever framed her difference as a method rather than a malfunction. He placed the notebook back and said the minds institutions call problems are usually the ones carrying questions the institution cannot answer. Something cracked open in Maya's chest. Not painfully, but like a window long painted shut, finally admitting air. Being truly seen for the first time does not feel like triumph. It feels like remembering a language you were told you had never spoken. You know that moment when someone finally sees you clearly, and suddenly the cost of being seen becomes terrifyingly real. The professor's words had unlocked something in Maya, but unlocked doors swing both ways, and freedom is always adjacent to danger. Part of her surged toward expression. Another part cataloged every past moment she had been punished for thinking out loud. This is the psychological war no one warns you about. Not a battle with the world, but a siege happening entirely within your own mind. She sat with her notebook open and wrote nothing, because some wars must be felt completely before they can be understood. The relief of being recognized had cracked her armor, and now every old fear was flooding through the breach she had not expected to open. Every nonconformist reaches this crossroads, where authenticity stops being a philosophy and becomes a price tag you must actually pay. She did not choose yet, but something in her had already quietly, irrevocably begun to lean toward the harder, truer direction. You have rehearsed your idea 1,000 times alone, but the room that finally hears it can become the cruelest audience imaginable. Maya's thesis landed in the room not like a spark, but like a question mark dropped into still water, and the ripples were not welcome. Ridicule is a scalpel the institution wields with precision. It does not destroy the idea. It targets the person holding it. The institution did not argue with her logic. It simply rerouted the corridors, making every door she reached somehow locked. Structural punishment is the quietest weapon. No accusation, just the slow removal of the scaffolding until you doubt your own footing. Every nonconformist eventually reaches this fault line, the place where external pressure and internal conviction meet and only one can survive. Validation had been her compass, but the system had just proven it was a borrowed instrument. What she needed was her own true north. The system's rejection was not evidence that she was wrong. It was the oldest proof that something genuinely new had arrived. You have sat alone with a truth so large it frightened you, wondering if surrendering it would finally bring you peace. Maya sat in the silence after the institution's verdict and felt something she had not expected. The exhaustion of pretending her mind was the problem. Every breakthrough she had ever made began to surface in memory, and a pattern she had never named started assembling itself with devastating clarity. The thinking pattern they had called her flaw, the relentless questioning, the refusal to accept inherited answers, was the exact engine of every solution she had found. What the world had diagnosed as deviation was, in the architecture of her mind, the precise instrument built for finding what consensus thinking always missed. The weight of that recognition did not feel like triumph. It felt like grief and liberation arriving in the same breath, inseparable. She was not broken and finally fixed. She had never been broken, and that distinction demanded she rewrite every story she had accepted about herself. The turning point nobody saw coming was not a decision or an action. It was a single moment of refusing to apologize for the shape of her mind. You stopped fighting yourself the moment you realized your mind was never broken. It was simply building something the world had not seen yet. Maya stopped asking permission to think differently and started asking what her different thinking could actually do for the world. The energy she once poured into mimicking others became fuel, redirected at last toward building something only she could build. Honest thinking, she learned, is not about being right. It is about being real, and reality is where every meaningful thing is built. She built in her own rhythm, not slower, not faster, but calibrated to something internal that the world's noise had always drowned out. The world does not need more people who think correctly. It desperately needs the ones brave enough to think honestly. What she chose to build was not a monument to her difference, but a door, so others who thought like her could finally walk through. Maya never fixed her mind. She finally trusted it, and in that trust she found the only belonging she had ever actually needed.